There is a framed certificate hanging in a small kitchen in Portastafogu in the southeastern interior of Sardinia. The certificate is from Guinness World Records dated August 2012. It was placed on the wall by Adolfo Mellis, the second oldest of the 9 siblings, 2 days after the family received it. Below the certificate on a low shelf sits a clay pot. The pot is older than the certificate by roughly 70 years. It belonged to their mother, Grazia. It is the pot in which she taught each of her 9 children to start the evening minestrone. Beans first, then water, then the stems of dark greens, never the leaves until the end. The kitchen is small, the certificate is high. The pot is at the level of a child's hands. The certificate documents the highest combined age of 9 living siblings ever measured, 818 years and 205 days. The oldest was Consolata, born in 1907. The youngest was Mafalda, born in 1925. Between them, 4 brothers and 3 other sisters. None of them had moved more than a few kilometers from the village. None of them had ever been hospitalized with chronic illness. When researchers arrived from the University of Sassari to interview them in 2013, all 9 were still alive. The youngest was 88. Consolata was 106. What follows is what they ate, what they did, who came on Sundays, and the household routines that 9 people sustained more or less unchanged across a century of European change. The certificate is on the wall because Guinness asked for documentation. The pot is on the shelf because Grazia put it there, and her daughters and sons have not moved it. In the village of Portastafogu in the Ogliastra region of central Sardinia, the rate at which men reach the age of 100 is roughly equal to the rate at which women reach 100. That sentence is unusual enough that it has been the subject of academic papers for 2 decades. In almost every other long-lived population on Earth, Okinawa, Loma Linda, Nicoya, the rest of mainland Italy, women outnumber centenarian men by ratios of 4 or 5 to 1. In the mountain interior of Sardinia, that ratio collapses. The village holds the highest concentration of male centenarians ever documented, and the Mellis family are the most photographed of them. A team led by Gianni Pes and Michel Poulain published the original Sardinian Blue Zone paper in experimental gerontology in 2004. The data they were working with, drawn from civil records going back to the late 1800s, showed that something specific to this geography, the genes, the soil, the food, the social structure, was protecting men in the highland interior from the cardiovascular mortality that had killed their counterparts everywhere else. The Mellis family were not the cause of the finding. They were the most concentrated single example of it. Adolfo, second of the 9, was 102 in the year the certificate arrived. He had been a baker for most of his working life. His hands were lined and strong. When a journalist asked him in 2013 what he had for breakfast, he answered without pausing, bread, cheese, a little wine, and whatever was in the bowl from the night before. Whatever was in the bowl from the night before is the line worth holding. The bowl in this kitchen was always the previous night's minestrone, kept on the back of the wood stove and reheated in the morning. The starch had retrograded overnight. The flavor had deepened. The beans had absorbed the broth. The first meal of the day in the Mellis kitchen was not designed for the morning. It was designed by the previous evening. Consolata, the eldest, was a 106 when researchers documented her daily food intake in 2013. The food was not rich. The portions were not large. What it was specific and consistent across 9 decades. The minestrone went on the stove between 4 and 5 in the afternoon. It was made from whatever beans were soaking, usually a combination of fava and small cannellini, occasionally chickpeas during the months when the local farmer who supplied them came down from the higher pastures. The base was vegetable, onion, garlic, a tomato when there were tomatoes, a spoonful of tomato paste when there were not. The greens went in last, chard or spinach in the colder months, wild bitter herbs from the hillside in the spring and summer. The pot simmered for 2 hours. The bowl was served when each member of the household sat down. The leftovers slept on the stove. Tomorrow's breakfast was already made. Now hold this in mind because we are coming back to it. The bowl is never empty. From October through August, the same pattern. There are no snack foods in the house. There is no second meal between lunch and dinner. There is no protein bar, no smoothie, no late-night raid of a refrigerator that does not contain anything to raid. The minestrone is the system is the bowl. A 2017 meta-analysis in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition pooled data from 18 longitudinal studies covering 5 million person-years of follow-up. Daily legume consumption, meaning eaten on most days, not occasionally, was associated with a 13 to 14% reduction in all-cause mortality. The mechanism, traced through the gut, runs through resistant starch and a family of compounds called short-chain fatty acids. Resistant starch is the carbohydrate fraction of beans that survives digestion in the small intestine. It arrives in the colon intact, where specific gut bacteria ferment it and produce butyrate. Honestly, when I first read the resistant starch literature, I was skeptical. The mechanism sounded too clean, too convenient in explanation for too consistent an outcome. But the meta-analyses have replicated, and the methodology in the better studies tracks plasma butyrate directly, not just dietary recall. Butyrate is the primary fuel for the cells lining the colon. When those cells are well fed, the gut barrier is tighter, systemic inflammation drops, and the slow accumulation of low-grade damage that drives most age-related disease runs at a lower temperature. Consolata's bowl was running this loop every evening for 90 years. Adolfo's breakfast was running it again the next morning. This is the food at the center of the Mellis kitchen. Not a superfood, not an ingredient list. The bowl that never empties. A note on the cooking: the beans were always soaked overnight. Always. Consolata could tell you the temperature of the water in her sleep. Cold, never warm, never hot. With a pinch of salt added only at the end of the next day's cooking. The skins toughen if salt arrives early. The cooking water from the soak was discarded. The pot was started fresh in the morning. These are not chef's tricks. These are the small mechanical details that any Sardinian grandmother passes to a daughter without thinking the lesson is worth naming. Now move with me to the second house up the road, because the food was only half of it. Adolfo's house was 3 doors from the bakery he ran until he retired at 78. After he retired, he kept walking the same route every morning at 5:30. He went to the bakery, now run by his grandson, sat in the kitchen with a glass of wine and a small wedge of pecorino for an hour, and walked home in time to help his wife with the morning chores. He had done this walk for 61 years by the time the certificate arrived. The walk did not have a step count. The wine did not have a brand. The cheese was always the same. Pecorino sourdough, aged at minimum 6 months, made from the milk of sheep that grazed on the same hillside above the village, where his father had grazed sheep before him. The pecorino in Adolfo's hand was not the same biological substance as the cheese on a shelf in an American supermarket. The sheep producing the milk had eaten wild oregano, myrtle, 10 species of legumes growing between the rocks, and the dry herbs of an island summer. The fat profile of milk from animals on that diet contains a fatty acid called conjugated linoleic acid, CLA, at concentrations roughly 2 to 3 times higher than the fat in commercial cow's milk dairy. CLA has been studied across more than 20 randomized controlled trials. The findings cluster around 2 effects: a measurable reduction in visceral fat over time and an improvement in insulin sensitivity. Neither effect is dramatic in any single trial, but neither effect goes away across the trials. And the Mellis family had been eating 30 grams of this cheese a day, every day for 8 or 9 decades each. A separate research finding I want to flag because it complicates the saturated fat conversation. Aged sheep cheese spends 6 to 12 months fermenting before anyone eats it. During those months, the bacteria break down lactose almost entirely, produce ACE inhibitory peptides that act on blood pressure pathways, and release the fat from its protein matrix in a form the body absorbs differently than intact cream. A 2015 Dairy Matrix meta-analysis compared equal amounts of saturated fat from aged cheese and from butter in randomized human trials. The cheese reduced LDL cholesterol. The butter raised it. Same fat, different result. The matrix changes the fat. The label says cheese. The biology, after fermentation, is something else. Adolfo did not know any of this. Pecorino was simply what was on the table. I want to step back for a moment and notice something that is easy to miss in the food. Adolfo's wife was at the stove most of the day. His grandson now ran the bakery. His sister-in-law lived next door. His great-grandchildren passed through the kitchen on their way home from school. The number of household tasks that involved another person was high. The number of meals eaten alone was zero. None of this appears on a meta-analysis, but the absence of solitary eating, the constant low-level conversation, the obligation to prepare food for others, and to receive food prepared by others, that is also data of a kind that researchers struggle to publish because the mechanism resists clean description. The pot continues to simmer. Across the village in the third house we will visit, Conchetta is doing something different. Conchetta, the third oldest of the 9 sisters, was 99 in 2013. Her house was at the edge of the village, where the road meets the hillside. From her front door, you could see 4 hectares of vineyard her family had tended for 3 generations. She did not own all 4 hectares anymore. After her husband died in 1991, her sons had taken over the work. But she still walked the rows every morning at 6 gosh before breakfast in any weather. She walked them slowly. She stopped to look at individual vines. She came back with a basket, sometimes herbs, sometimes a few grapes, sometimes nothing but the fact of having walked. The grape was Cannonau, the same Sardinian variety the ACA project researchers had identified as the local source of one of the highest polyphenol concentrations measured in any wine region globally. Conchetta did not drink heavily. A small glass at lunch, a small glass at dinner. Sometimes a sip of grappa with her brother on a holiday. That was the entire register. The wine was on the table, with the meal, poured for whichever member sat down. The amount was the same as it had been when she was 20. I want to be specific about a piece of the wine literature because it gets oversold and undersold equally often. Resveratrol, one of the polyphenols in red wine, has been studied as a supplement at high doses. The trials have not shown the benefits the observational data on wine drinking populations suggest. Several capsule trials have been disappointing. What this means most honestly is that isolating one molecule out of the wine matrix and packaging it into a capsule is a different intervention than a small daily glass of unfiltered Cannonau alongside food and other people. The matrix is the medicine, the capsule is the molecule. They are not the same thing. Conchetta's daily wine was not why she was 99. It was one of dozens of small inputs across 100 years. But the input was real, and it appeared in the diet of every Mellis sibling, every day for every adult year of their lives. The fourth element of the Mellis kitchen was the olive oil. Not a drizzle, not a careful tablespoon. The amount was generous in a way that struck visiting researchers as excessive until they tasted what was in the bottle. The oil came from olives grown within 20 kilometers of the village. It was pressed in October and November of each year, never blended with older oil, and kept in a dark glass bottle on the kitchen counter. It was poured over vegetables after they came off the heat. It was the base of every sauté. It was the finish on the minestrone. It was the dressing on every raw thing that arrived at the table. In 2022, a team at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health analyzed health data from 92,000 American adults followed for 28 years. Consuming more than half a tablespoon of fresh olive oil daily was associated with a 28% lower cardiovascular mortality. The compound credited with most of the cellular work is a phenolic called oleocanthal, which inhibits the same inflammatory enzymes as low-dose ibuprofen. The dose response in the Harvard data is graded, meaning more oil, more protective effect, up to a point. The Mellis family was at that point. Adolfo's bread was dipped in oil before the cheese went on. Conchetta's morning lunch, a piece of bread, a few olives, a slice of pecorino, sat in a small plate with a 1/4 inch of oil at the bottom that the bread soaked up. The Harvard study was tracking a fraction of what these households were doing. The bowl is still on the stove. The vines are still being walked. The bottle of oil is still on the counter. We are coming back to the kitchen we started in. Before I take you back to Consolata's table, and there is one specific scene there I want you to see, I want to interrupt this once with something you can use immediately. Everything I have walked you through so far is one zone of the 5-zone Blue Zone body reset. The complete protocol covers Sardinia, Okinawa, Ikaria, Nicoya, and Loma Linda. Week by week, with the shopping list already structured, the weekly meal templates worked out, and a printable tracker for the kitchen. It is a PDF. It downloads in 60 seconds. It works on a phone, a tablet, or the screen you are reading on right now. If you are watching on a television set, the QR code on screen will take you straight to the page. On a phone or computer, the link is below this video. Now back to the kitchen. Consolata's table on a Sunday in November of 2013 looks like this. The certificate from Guinness is on the wall above her shoulder. The pot has been on the stove since 4 in the afternoon. Around the table sit her surviving siblings: Adolfo, Concetta, Mafalda, Vitalio, Vitalia, Maria, and a rotating set of children, grandchildren, neighbors, and great-grandchildren who treat Consolata's house the way the village had always treated the eldest house. She does not sit at the head. There is no head. The table is round. She sits where she has always sat, with the wall behind her and the kitchen door to her left, so she can see who is arriving. The conversation does not stop for the meal. The conversation is the meal. The minestrone arrives one bowl at a time, served by Mafalda and a granddaughter named Lucia. The bread is in the middle. The oil is in a small jug. Each person reaches for what they need. There is no announcement of a course. There is no plate that arrives only for the host. There is no separation between the eating and the talking and the gentle arguing about whether the rosemary was added too early. I do not know how to write what is happening in this scene without it sounding sentimental, so I will write it the way the researchers wrote it in their notes from that visit. Quote, "The level of family integration we observed in this household is consistent with the patterns reported across centenarian cohorts in the Ogliastra region, but is more pronounced in this case because of the unusual concentration of long-lived siblings and their continued active involvement in daily and weekly household routines." End quote. Translated, the family was still showing up for each other every Sunday at Consolata's table after a century of doing so. There is research that gives this its proper weight. In 2010, Julianne Holt-Lundstad and her team at Brigham Young University published a meta-analysis in PLOS Medicine that compiled 148 studies covering 308,000 participants. The finding was that adequate social relationships were associated with a 50% greater likelihood of survival across the studied periods. 50%. That number exceeds the survival benefit associated with quitting smoking at midlife. It exceeds the benefit associated with regular exercise. It exceeds the magnitude of any single dietary intervention measured at population scale. The Mellis Kitchen was running this variable on Consolata's birthday for 106 years. There is one more piece of the Mellis story that the researchers documented but rarely publish. None of the 9 siblings had retired into irrelevance. Adolfo had handed the bakery to his grandson, but he was at the bakery every morning at 6 a.m. Concetta had stopped owning the vineyard, but she was walking the rows. Mafalda had moved closer to the village center, but she was still preparing the Sunday bread. Consolata, at 106, was consulted on family decisions. Her opinion on how the minestrone should be salted was sought, not tolerated. The youngest siblings, themselves in their 90s, would call her in the evening to ask whether the chickpeas needed another day of soaking. She did not always have the right answer, but she was being asked. I think about this a lot in the context of what retirement looks like in the modern American model. The day a person stops working, the architecture of their day collapses. The meetings, the responsibilities, the people who depended on their decisions, gone. All at once on a Friday afternoon. Most people underestimate how much identity and daily purpose were embedded in that structure. The Sardinian mountain communities did not retire their elders into irrelevance. They kept them at the center of the family's operational life. Consolata was not celebrated for having survived. She was needed. That is not the same word. What that means biologically in the cortisol and inflammatory data in long-running cohort studies of socially central elders supports this, is that the body never received the signal that its purpose was done. The cortisol response to mild daily stress stays modulated when that stress is balanced by daily relevance. The autonomic nervous system runs in a different register when one is consulted on what to put in tomorrow's bread. None of this is captured in a dietary table. All of it is part of the answer to the question of how 9 siblings in one house sustained 818 combined years. Now, before we close, and I want to come back to the pot and the certificate one more time, I want to give you one practical thing. If you take nothing else from this video, take this. Tonight, before you go to sleep, place 1 cup of dried beans in a bowl. Cover them with cold water, 3 inches above the bean line. Add nothing else. Leave them on the counter overnight. Tomorrow morning, they will be ready. Drain them, rinse them, and put them in a pot with fresh cold water and whatever vegetables are in your kitchen. Onion, garlic, a tomato if you have one, a sprig of rosemary, a pinch of salt at the very end. Cover them with twice their volume of water. Bring to a boil, reduce to a simmer. Walk away, 2 hours. The bowl will be there in the evening. The next morning, the bowl will still be there. That is the start. I'm going to ask you something now, not as a content request, but because the answer matters to whether this video does what it is supposed to do. Out of the 4 ordinary things on the Mellis table, the bowl of beans, the small wedge of aged sheep cheese, the bottle of olive oil, the small glass of unfiltered red wine, which one is already in your kitchen tonight? Not in some future trip to the store? Tonight, in your house right now. The closer you already are to the table, the easier the rest of it gets. Tell me in the comments. The sample size matters. I read what comes in. It is now late afternoon in Perdas de Fogo. The bowl on the back of the stove has been simmering since 4 wasen. Adolfo is walking back from the bakery, slowly, with a small loaf wrapped in cloth under his arm. Conchetta is in her kitchen at the edge of the village, sweeping the floor before her son arrives for dinner. Mafalda is laying the table at Consoladas. The certificate from Guinness is on the wall. The clay pot is on the low shelf where Grazia put it. The light through the small kitchen window is beginning to go red. Tomorrow morning, the bowl will not be empty. That is the whole system in one sentence. The bowl is never empty. If this story changes the way you look at the simple ingredients in your pantry, please subscribe and like the channel. We are uncovering the history and the habits that have been hidden in plain sight. Let's plant the seeds for a longer future together. The next treasure will be revealed soon.